The old king's hands trembled as he watched the legendary Viking chieftain writhe in agony, his body covered in venomous serpents, their fangs sinking deeper with each breath. King Aelle of Northumbria smiled, believing he had ended the greatest threat to England. But in that pit of snakes, as Ragnar Lothbrok sang his death song, he uttered words that would echo across the North Sea and bring apocalypse to English shores. How the little pigs would grunt if they knew how the old boar suffers. Those weren't just the ramblings of a dying man. They were a prophecy, a promise, a curse that would manifest in the largest Viking invasion force ever assembled. An army so vast and terrible that chroniclers would call it the Great Heathen Army, and its arrival would mark the beginning of the end for Anglo-Saxon England. The year was 865 AD, and across the storm-tossed waters of the North Sea, the sons of Ragnar were gathering their forces, sharpening their axes, and preparing to paint England red with the blood of revenge. This is the story of how one man's execution sparked a campaign of vengeance that would reshape the map of Britain, destroy kingdoms that had stood for centuries, and establish Viking rule over more than half of England. It's a tale of brotherhood and betrayal, of tactical genius and savage brutality, of kings who underestimated their enemies and paid with their lives and kingdoms. But before we witness the storm that descended upon England, we must understand the man whose death set it all in motion, and why his execution was the single greatest mistake any English king ever made. Ragnar Lothbrok, whether he was one man or a composite of several legendary Vikings, remains debated by historians, had become the most feared name in Western Europe by the middle of the 9th century. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, though typically sparse in its descriptions of Viking raiders, makes special mention of a chieftain matching Ragnar's description, who raided the coasts of England and Francia with unprecedented success. The Frankish annals of Estibertan describe a Viking leader who extracted enormous tribute from the Franks and demonstrated military innovation that terrorized continental Europe. Whether historical or legendary, Ragnar represented something new in Viking warfare. Not just a raider seeking quick plunder, but a strategist who understood that sustained campaigns and psychological warfare could yield far greater rewards than hit-and-run attacks. His raids on Paris, his campaigns in Francia, and his expeditions to England had made him wealthy beyond measure and famous throughout Scandinavia. Young warriors flocked to his banner, eager to share in the glory and riches that seemed to follow Ragnar wherever his longships sailed. But more important than his wealth or fame were his sons, Ivar, Bjorn, Fitzurk, Sigurd, and Ub, each a formidable warrior in his own right, each commanding loyalty from hundreds of battle-hardened Vikings, and each devoted to their father with a fierce intensity that combined love, respect, and the martial values that defined Norse culture. When Ragnar decided to launch what would be his final expedition to England, these sons urged caution, warned of the growing strength of the English kingdoms, but Ragnar, whether driven by pride, fate, or simple miscalculation, insisted on sailing with just 2 ships and a small crew. The North Sea had other plans. A storm of such ferocity struck his small fleet that it seemed the gods themselves had turned against him, scattering his ships and driving the survivors onto the Northumbrian coast, battered, weakened, and vulnerable. King Aelle of Northumbria had been consolidating his power in the north of England, dealing with internal rivals and the constant threat of Scottish incursions, when news reached him that a Viking force had been shipwrecked on his shores. For years, Aelle had watched helplessly as Viking raiders struck his coastal settlements, burned his monasteries, and enslaved his people before vanishing back across the sea. Now, fortune had delivered one of these heathens directly into his hands, and not just any Viking, but the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok himself. The sources disagree on whether Aelle immediately recognized his captive or only learned his identity through interrogation, but what's certain is that once Aelle understood who he had captured, he saw an opportunity not just for revenge, but for propaganda. A chance to demonstrate English strength and discourage future Viking raids by making an example of their most famous leader. The method of execution Aelle chose reveals much about the brutality of 9th century justice and the king's desire to send an unmistakable message. Ragnar would die slowly, publicly, and in agony. The snake pit, a form of execution that appears in both Norse saga and some historical accounts, involved throwing the condemned into a pit filled with venomous serpents, where death came from multiple bites over hours or even days. Whether such pits actually existed or whether this detail represents saga embellishment remains uncertain, but what matters is that the Norse believed it happened, and that belief fueled their rage. According to the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons, as the snakes bit into his flesh and the poison coursed through his veins, Ragnar sang a death song, a traditional Norse poem recounting his victories and facing death without fear, demonstrating the courage that Norse culture valued above all else. The saga records his final words about the little pigs grunting when they learned of the old boar's suffering, a clear reference to his sons and a prediction of the vengeance they would exact. When news of Ragnar's death reached Scandinavia, carried by survivors who had witnessed his capture or by spies and traders who trafficked in information across the North Sea, it ignited a firestorm of rage across the Norse world. Ragnar's sons, scattered across Scandinavia and already leading their own raiding expeditions, received the news with a mixture of grief and fury that would reshape their lives and redirect their considerable military talents toward a single purpose: making England pay for their father's death in blood and terror. Ivar the Boneless, the eldest and most enigmatic of Ragnar's sons, has puzzled historians for centuries with his mysterious nickname. Some scholars suggest boneless referred to a genetic condition that affected his legs, perhaps osteogenesis imperfecta, forcing him to be carried into battle on a shield but not diminishing his strategic genius or his fearsome reputation. Others argue the name might have been mistranslated or misunderstood, possibly referring to unusual flexibility, impotence, or even a kenning, a metaphorical Norse phrase whose original meaning became lost or garbled over generations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle makes no mention of any physical disability, describing him simply as a leader of the heathens whose cunning and cruelty exceeded that of his brothers. What's indisputable is that Ivar possessed a tactical mind that would prove instrumental in the conquest of England, an ability to see 3 moves ahead of his enemies, and a capacity for psychological warfare that terrorized his opponents. Where his brothers preferred straightforward battle and personal glory, Ivar understood logistics, strategy, and the power of fear as a weapon. When word reached him of his father's death, he was leading raids in Ireland, building alliances with local Norse settlements, and consolidating power in Dublin. The historical record suggests Ivar didn't immediately rush to avenge his father but instead spent months planning, gathering intelligence about England's political landscape, and building the coalition that would become the Great Heathen Army. This patience, this willingness to delay gratification for tactical advantage, characterized Ivar's approach to warfare and helps explain why the Great Heathen Army succeeded where previous Viking expeditions had failed. Bjorn Ironside, called such for his seeming invulnerability in battle, represented the traditional Viking warrior ideal. Brave to the point of recklessness, personally formidable in combat, and charismatic enough to inspire fierce loyalty from his warriors. Unlike Ivar's calculating approach, Bjorn fought from the front ranks, his reputation built on personal prowess and the kind of heroic deeds that become legends. At the time of Ragnar's death, Bjorn was campaigning in the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of North Africa and southern Europe in expeditions that demonstrated the extraordinary range of Viking maritime capabilities. Some sources suggest Bjorn initially hesitated to join the invasion of England, considering his Mediterranean campaigns more profitable and his chances of becoming a legendary explorer greater if he pushed further into unknown waters. But brotherhood and honor, the twin pillars of Norse culture, ultimately proved stronger than personal ambition. When Ivar sent word of their plan to invade England, Bjorn agreed to join, bringing with him battle-hardened warriors who had fought under the burning Mediterranean sun and learned tactics from observing Moorish and Byzantine military practices. The brothers understood that their combined forces, their diverse combat experiences, and their unified purpose would create something unprecedented in Viking history. Not a raid, but a conquest. Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, and Ub, the other sons of Ragnar, each commanded respect and loyalty within the Norse world. Each brought their own warriors and ships to the gathering storm, and each had their own reasons for joining the invasion beyond simple revenge. Hvitserk, whose name possibly means white shirt, or whose identity might have merged with other historical Vikings in the saga tradition, appears in the records as a fierce warrior who fought alongside his brothers throughout the English campaign. Sigurd, marked from birth with a serpent-shaped mark in his eye, whether a real condition, a birthmark, or saga embellishment, had established himself as a successful raider along the Frankish coast. Ub, often depicted as the most level-headed of the brothers, had been building settlements in Frisia and understanding that Viking expansion required not just conquest but colonization, establishing permanent communities rather than simply extracting plunder. When these 5 brothers, along with other prominent Viking leaders who saw opportunity in the campaign, sent out the call for warriors, the response exceeded even their expectations. From Norway, Sweden, and Denmark they came. From the Norse settlements in Ireland and the Scottish Islands. From the Orkney and Shetland Islands where Viking jarls ruled. Even from as far as Iceland, which had only recently been settled by Norse adventurers. They came for revenge, certainly, but also for land, for glory, for adventure, and for the chance to be part of something that would be remembered in saga and song for generations. The historical sources struggle to quantify the size of this force. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply calls it a Great Heathen Army, while Norse sagas speak of hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors, numbers that modern historians treat with skepticism but which nonetheless indicate a force of unprecedented size for Viking expeditions. Conservative estimates suggest between 2,000 and 5,000 warriors, though some historians argue the army might have been significantly larger, especially as it attracted more Vikings after early successes. What matters more than the exact number is that this force represented something qualitatively different from previous Viking raids. It was organized, supplied for extended campaigning, and led by multiple experienced commanders who could coordinate complex military operations. The Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, arriving not as scattered raiding parties, but as a unified invasion force that immediately demonstrated its organizational sophistication. The landing site itself was chosen strategically. East Anglia had been a target of Viking raids for decades, its monasteries rich with silver and religious artifacts, but more importantly, its geographic position offered access to the entire eastern coast of England and river systems that could facilitate rapid movement inland. King Edmund of East Anglia faced an impossible choice: fight an army that vastly outnumbered his forces and risk immediate destruction, or negotiate, buy time, and hope for help from neighboring kingdoms. He chose negotiation, a decision that would haunt him later but which, in the moment, seemed the only rational response to overwhelming force. The Vikings demanded horses, not for plunder but for military mobility, revealing their intention to campaign inland rather than simply raid coastal targets, and supplies for winter quarters. In exchange, they offered to spare East Anglia from immediate attack, a promise they technically kept, though the kingdom's respite would prove temporary. This pattern of accepting tribute, establishing winter quarters, and using the breathing space to plan their next move would characterize the Great Heathen Army's campaign, demonstrating patience and strategic thinking that previous Viking expeditions had lacked. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's entry for 865 notes tersely: "In this year came a great heathen army to England and took up winter quarters in East Anglia, and there they were supplied with horses, and the East Anglians made peace with them." This brief entry masks the terror that must have gripped England as word spread of the army's size and organization, and the growing realization among English kings that this was no ordinary raid. The political landscape of 9th century England had been shaped by generations of warfare among competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, each claiming supremacy, each guarding its independence jealously, and each more concerned with its traditional English rivals than with preparing for external threats. The Heptarchy, though not actually 7 kingdoms by this period, consisted primarily of 4 major powers: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, East Anglia in the east, and Wessex in the south. Northumbria, once the most powerful kingdom and the cultural heart of English Christianity during the Age of Bede, had declined dramatically, weakened by internal succession disputes and the increasing boldness of Viking raids. King Aelle, who had executed Ragnar, ruled a kingdom already diminished from its former glory, its northern borders threatened by Picts and Scots, its coastal settlements regularly pillaged by Norse raiders. Mercia, under various rulers, had once dominated central England, but by 865 it too faced internal divisions and the constant challenge of maintaining authority over a patchwork of subkingdoms and client tribes. East Anglia, as we've seen, had already submitted to the Great Heathen Army, buying temporary survival at the cost of providing the Vikings with the resources they needed for extended campaigning. Wessex, the southernmost kingdom, would eventually become the savior of Anglo-Saxon England, but in 865 it was just another kingdom worried about its survival, ruled by King Ethelred and his younger brother Alfred, who would later be called the Great, but who in 865 was merely a prince learning the arts of warfare and statecraft. This fragmentation, the inability or unwillingness of English kingdoms to unite against a common threat, would prove catastrophic, allowing the Vikings to defeat each kingdom individually when a coordinated English defense might have repelled the invasion. The Great Heathen Army's first major campaign target was Northumbria, a choice that was both strategic and personal. Strategic because Northumbria's weakness made it vulnerable, personal because its king had killed Ragnar. The Vikings marched north in 866, their movements swift due to the horses they had extorted from East Anglia, and captured York, called Jorvik by the Vikings, in November of that year. York was Northumbria's capital, a former Roman city whose walls and strategic position at the confluence of rivers made it one of the most important urban centers in northern England. The city's fall shocked the English, not just because of York's importance but because of the speed and efficiency of the Viking assault. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records, "In this year the army came to York, and the Northumbrians gathered against them, and they made a great attack against them. There was much slaughter of the Northumbrians, some within and some without, and both kings were killed, and the survivors made peace." This entry compresses months of conflict into a few sentences, but unpacking those events reveals the Vikings' tactical sophistication and the deadly effectiveness of their military system. When the Vikings approached York, they found a city divided by civil war. King Aelle faced a rival claimant, Osbert, who disputed his legitimacy, and this internal conflict had already weakened Northumbrian defenses. The Vikings, with Ivar's strategic genius guiding their decisions, chose to strike during this moment of maximum vulnerability, and York's defenders, divided in loyalty and unprepared for an attack of such magnitude, could not mount an effective defense. The capture of York gave the Vikings their first major English city and a base of operations that would remain in Norse hands for generations, eventually becoming the capital of the Viking Kingdom of York and a major center of Norse culture in England. But the brothers had not forgotten their primary purpose. King Aelle still lived, still held authority over parts of Northumbria, and still needed to pay for Ragnar's death. The sources differ on exactly how Aelle met his end. Norse sagas describe an execution method so brutal it has become legendary, while English chronicles remain suspiciously silent about the details of their king's death. According to the saga of Ragnar's sons, the brothers captured Aelle and subjected him to the blood eagle, a horrific execution method that involved cutting the ribs from the spine and pulling the lungs out through the resulting opening to create a wing-like appearance. Modern historians debate whether the blood eagle actually existed or whether it represents a mistranslation or poetic invention, but the saga's description served a clear purpose: demonstrating that the sons had avenged their father with an execution as terrible as the one Aelle had inflicted on Ragnar. Whether the blood eagle happened as described or whether Aelle simply died in the battle for York, the symbolic importance remains the same. The king who had executed Ragnar was dead, Northumbria had fallen, and the Great Heathen Army had announced its capabilities in the most brutal terms possible. The psychological impact of Northumbria's collapse rippled across England. If the kingdom that had once been Bede's Northumbria, the center of English learning and Christian culture, could fall so completely, what chance did other kingdoms have? Yet the brothers didn't stop with Aelle's death. Vengeance satisfied one hunger, but the Great Heathen Army had crossed the North Sea with larger ambitions. The wealth of England's monasteries, the rich farmland of its river valleys, and the opportunity to carve out kingdoms in conquered territory. These practical considerations transformed what began as a revenge expedition into a war of conquest. In 867, the army marched south from York, establishing control over much of Northumbria and setting up a puppet ruler to govern in their name while they moved on to richer targets. This pattern, conquest followed by installation of client kings who would maintain order and collect taxes on behalf of Viking overlords, demonstrated political sophistication that went far beyond simple raiding. The Vikings understood that territory had no value if it couldn't be held and exploited, and holding territory required some form of legitimate authority that could function in their absence. By installing English rulers who owed their thrones to Viking support, the brothers created a system that would allow them to extract wealth from conquered territories without tying down their forces in garrison duty. This administrative genius, likely Ivar's contribution, would prove as important to the Vikings' success as their military victories. Mercia, the Great Midland Kingdom, became the next target, and here the Great Heathen Army's campaign reveals the sophistication of their intelligence gathering and strategic planning. Rather than attacking Mercia at its strongest point, the Vikings exploited the kingdom's complex geography and political divisions. Mercia controlled a vast territory, but that territory consisted of diverse regions with varying degrees of loyalty to the central authority, and its frontiers were constantly contested by Welsh kingdoms to the west and by Wessex to the south. In 868, the army marched on Nottingham, a strategically important town that controlled river crossings and trade routes. King Burgred of Mercia, recognizing he couldn't defeat the Vikings alone, did something unprecedented. He called for help from Wessex, temporarily setting aside the traditional rivalry between the two kingdoms in the face of this existential threat. King Ethelred of Wessex and his brother Alfred responded, marching north with a West Saxon army to aid their Mercian neighbors. This West Saxon intervention marks the first appearance of Alfred in the Viking Wars, and while the sources tell us little about the young prince's role in the Nottingham campaign, it must have been a formative experience, teaching him about Viking tactics and the challenges of fighting a professional army that understood logistics and defensive warfare. The combined Mercian and West Saxon forces laid siege to Nottingham, but the Vikings, secured behind the town's fortifications and well-supplied for a long standoff, refused to give battle under disadvantageous conditions. This restraint, the willingness to avoid battle when circumstances didn't favor them, represented a dramatic departure from the heroic warrior ethos that emphasized personal valor and glorious combat. The Vikings fought when it suited their purposes and avoided battle when it didn't, a pragmatic approach that frustrated English commanders schooled in traditional warfare. The siege dragged on inconclusively until Burgred, facing economic disruption and the costs of maintaining an army in the field, negotiated a settlement. The Vikings agreed to leave Mercia for the time being in exchange for tribute, and both sides could claim a sort of victory. Burgred had driven the invaders from Mercian territory, while the Vikings had gained wealth without risking their forces in an uncertain battle. But the real lesson of Nottingham was that the Great Heathen Army couldn't be defeated by traditional means, and that the fragile cooperation between English kingdoms might not be enough to stop them. The army returned to York for the winter of 868 to 869, consolidating their control over Northumbria and planning their next moves. These winter quarters served multiple purposes beyond simple survival during England's cold months. They allowed the Vikings to rest, repair equipment, integrate new recruits who had heard of their successes and sailed from Scandinavia to join them, and most importantly, to plan campaigns with the kind of strategic foresight that separated professional armies from raiding bands. The sources suggest that during these winter quarters, disagreements emerged among the brothers about future strategy. Some, likely including Bjorn, argued for taking their wealth and returning to Scandinavia or pushing into new territories where resistance might be lighter. Others, probably led by Ivar, insisted that the conquest of England should continue, that the opportunity to carve out kingdoms was too valuable to abandon for mere plunder. These debates, reconstructed by historians from fragmentary evidence and the later trajectories of the brothers' careers, reveal the tensions inherent in Viking military coalitions. Each leader commanded his own warriors, each had his own goals, and unity required constant negotiation and the distribution of enough success that no faction felt cheated. That the brothers managed to keep the Great Heathen Army together for as long as they did speaks to their political skills and their ability to maintain momentum through continuous military success. In autumn of 869, the Great Heathen Army marched south again, this time targeting East Anglia, whose King Edmund had bought peace 4 years earlier by providing horses and supplies. That temporary safety had expired, and now the Vikings came to collect a more permanent settlement. King Edmund faced the same impossible choice that had confronted Aelle and Burgred: submit to Viking overlordship or fight and face probable destruction. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later hagiographical accounts, Edmund chose to fight, perhaps believing that God would protect a Christian king defending his realm against heathens, perhaps calculating that submission would cost him his throne regardless, or perhaps simply deciding that death in battle was preferable to the slow humiliation of puppet kingship. The Battle of Hoxne, if it can be called a battle rather than a massacre, resulted in complete East Anglian defeat, and Edmund's fate became one of the most controversial and mythologized events of the entire Viking invasion. The historical Edmund, about whom we know frustratingly little beyond his coinage and the fact of his death, was transformed by later Christian writers into Street Edmund the Martyr, his death becoming a symbol of Christian steadfastness against pagan cruelty. According to the earliest account, written by Abbo of Fleury around 985 based on traditions he collected in England, Edmund was captured after the battle and offered terms. He could remain king if he acknowledged Viking overlordship and shared power with a Viking co-ruler. Edmund refused, declaring he would never submit to pagans or share his Christian kingdom with heathens. The Vikings, according to this account, tied him to a tree and used him for archery practice, filling his body with arrows before beheading him. Modern historians debate the reliability of this account, noting that it was written more than a century after the events, during a period when creating martyr cults served political and religious purposes, and that earlier sources simply state Edmund died fighting the Vikings without elaborating on the circumstances. Yet the martyrdom narrative became immensely popular. Edmund's shrine at Bury St. Edmunds became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in medieval England, and the story of his steadfast refusal to compromise with pagans inspired English resistance to Viking rule for generations. Whether Edmund died as a martyr refusing to compromise with pagans or simply as a defeated king killed in the aftermath of battle, his death marked the effective end of East Anglia as an independent kingdom. The Vikings annexed the territory, installed their own rulers, and began the process of settlement that would transform East Anglia into part of what later became known as the Danelaw, the region of England where Danish law and customs prevailed, where Vikings settled as farmers and merchants rather than just warriors, and where Norse and English cultures would intermingle to create something new. This settlement pattern reveals the Great Heathen Army's evolution from a raiding force into a conquering army with colonization objectives. Warriors who had crossed the North Sea seeking plunder and glory were now staking claims to land, bringing wives and families from Scandinavia, and establishing the agricultural communities that would make Viking presence in England permanent. The transformation from raiders to settlers, from temporary invaders to permanent residents, changed the nature of the conflict. These Vikings couldn't simply be paid off or driven away because they had nowhere to go, and they fought with the desperation of men defending their new homes rather than the calculated risk-taking of raiders who could always retreat to their ships. With Northumbria conquered, Mercia intimidated into paying tribute, and East Anglia annexed, only Wessex remained as a significant independent English kingdom, and the brothers turned their attention south. Wessex in 870 was ruled by King Ethelred, but increasingly his younger brother Alfred was taking on military responsibilities as the Viking threat intensified. The campaign against Wessex would prove different from previous conquests. The West Saxons had been preparing for this moment, had learned from the defeats of their neighbors, and possessed in Alfred a military mind that could match even Ivar's strategic genius. The Vikings established a fortified camp at Reading, strategically positioned where the River Kennet flows into the Thames, giving them access to water transport, defensive advantages from the converging rivers, and a base from which to raid deep into West Saxon territory. The campaign that followed consisted of a series of battles throughout 870 and 871. More sustained combat than the Vikings had faced since landing in England, and for the first time they encountered an English army that could challenge them tactically. The Battle of Englefield in December 870 resulted in a West Saxon victory, the first significant English success against the Great Heathen Army, and though it was a relatively small engagement, it demonstrated that the Vikings could be beaten if faced with determined opposition and competent leadership. The West Saxons followed up with an attack on the Viking camp at Reading in early 871. But this assault failed catastrophically, with Ethelred's army being repulsed with heavy casualties. 4 days later, on January 8, 871, the two armies met again at the Battle of Ashdown, one of the most celebrated battles in Anglo-Saxon history. The sources, particularly Asser's Life of King Alfred written later in Alfred's reign, describe Alfred, still a prince at this point, taking command when his brother delayed in attending religious services before battle, and leading a furious charge up the hillside against the Viking position. Whether Asser's account exaggerates Alfred's role for propagandistic purposes or accurately describes his battlefield initiative, the result was undeniable. The West Saxons won a significant victory, killing one of the Viking kings, possibly Bagsec, who had joined the invasion force, and driving the Great Heathen Army from the field in disarray. This victory should have been a turning point, but the Vikings' resilience and their reinforcements from Scandinavia allowed them to recover quickly. 2 weeks after Ashdown, the armies clashed again at Basing, and this time the Vikings won decisively, erasing the West Saxon momentum from their previous victory. The campaign continued through the winter and into spring, with battles at Meriton and other locations, and the constant warfare began to exhaust both sides. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in its entry for 871, lists 9 major battles between West Saxons and Vikings, along with numerous smaller skirmishes, creating a picture of almost continuous combat throughout the year. This intensity of warfare was unprecedented in England, and it extracted a terrible toll. In April 871, King Ethelred died. The sources don't specify whether from battle wounds, disease, or other causes, leaving his younger brother Alfred to inherit the throne of Wessex at age 22, at arguably the most dangerous moment in the kingdom's history. The Great Heathen Army stood poised to complete its conquest of England, having defeated or subdued every other English kingdom, and now faced an untested young king with a depleted army and a realm that had endured a year of devastating warfare. Alfred's accession occurred during or immediately after another battle at Wilton, which resulted in a Viking victory, and the new king found himself in an impossible strategic position. He couldn't defeat the Vikings militarily with the forces available, couldn't obtain meaningful help from other English kingdoms that were themselves conquered or cowed, and couldn't sustain the economic costs of continuous warfare that was destroying his kingdom's agricultural base. Alfred did what he had criticized Burgred and Edmund for doing. He negotiated, paid tribute, and bought peace. The Vikings, also exhausted by the intensive campaigning and facing West Saxon resistance that was far stiffer than they had encountered in other kingdoms, accepted the payment and agreed to leave Wessex alone for the time being. Both sides needed time to recover, regroup, and prepare for the next round of conflict. The Great Heathen Army withdrew from Wessex to London in 871 to 872, using the old Roman city as a winter base and consolidating control over territories already conquered. This pause in conquest allowed the Vikings to transition more fully from invasion force to occupying power, establishing administrative systems, settling disputes among their own leaders about the division of conquered territory, and integrating the continuous flow of new warriors arriving from Scandinavia who wanted to share in the conquests. It's during this period that the historical sources become particularly frustrating, because they focus primarily on military campaigns and battles while providing almost no information about the administrative, economic, and social transformations occurring in Viking-controlled territories. We know from archaeological evidence, place name studies, and later documents that extensive Scandinavian settlement occurred in the former kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, that Viking administrative divisions and legal customs were imposed, and that Norse and English communities began the complex process of coexistence, conflict, and eventual cultural blending. We know from coin evidence that the Vikings quickly established their own mints and began issuing coinage, both copying English designs and creating distinctively Scandinavian types, suggesting sophisticated understanding of monetary economics and the importance of maintaining economic infrastructure. We know from the sudden appearance of Scandinavian loan words in English, particularly in regions that became the Danelaw, that linguistic mixing occurred rapidly, with English absorbing Norse vocabulary related to law, governance, and everyday life. What we don't know with any precision is how this transition occurred on the ground, how English populations responded to Viking overlordship, whether resistance continued or whether pragmatic accommodation prevailed, how much violence accompanied the settlement process, and how English and Norse communities negotiated the terms of their coexistence. In 872, the army moved to Torksey and Lindsey, on the border between Mercia and Northumbria, a location that allowed them to dominate both kingdoms and prepare for their next move against Mercia. King Burgred, who had successfully defended Nottingham with West Saxon help in 868, now faced the Vikings alone. Wessex was in no position to help, having only recently paid tribute to secure its own survival, and Mercia's internal divisions had worsened during the intervening years. In 873, the Vikings captured Repton, a site of enormous symbolic importance to Mercia. Repton had been a royal monastery, the burial place of Mercian kings, the spiritual heart of the kingdom's ruling dynasty. The capture and desecration of Repton, archaeological excavations have revealed mass graves of Viking warriors and evidence of the fortifications they constructed using the monastery itself as their base, represented not just a military victory but a symbolic destruction of Mercian royal legitimacy. Burgred, his authority shattered and his kingdom collapsing around him, made a choice that ensured his survival but destroyed his reputation. He fled to Rome, abandoning his kingdom to seek refuge in the Christian heart of Europe. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records tersely, "In this year the army drove King Burgred across the sea, after he had held the kingdom 22 years, and conquered all that land. And he went to Rome and settled there, and his body is buried in the Church of St. Mary in the English Quarter." This abandonment of his kingdom earned Burgred the contempt of English chroniclers, who contrasted his flight with Edmund's martyrdom and Alfred's steadfast resistance. But from Burgred's perspective, the choice might have seemed rational. Better to live in exile than die defending an already lost cause. Better to preserve his life and perhaps return if circumstances changed than to throw it away in a futile last stand. With Burgred gone, the Vikings installed Ceolwulf II as king of Mercia, choosing an English nobleman who would serve as their puppet and maintain some semblance of traditional governance, while real power rested with Viking overlords. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written in Wessex and hostile to any English collaboration with Vikings, calls Ceolwulf a foolish king's thane, and claims he swore oaths to the Vikings and provided hostages to guarantee his compliance. Modern historians have attempted to rehabilitate Ceolwulf's reputation somewhat, noting that he managed to maintain some degree of Mercian autonomy, and that ruling as a client king might have preserved more of Mercian culture and institutions than outright Viking annexation would have. Yet there's no escaping the essential reality. Mercia, which had been the dominant power in 8th century England, which had humbled Wessex and dominated East Anglia, which had produced great kings like Offa who had corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal, had been reduced to a client state ruled by a puppet king at Viking sufferance. The collapse of Mercia left Wessex truly isolated, the last independent English kingdom in a land increasingly dominated by Scandinavian power. The year 874 marked a crucial turning point in the Great Heathen Army's campaign, but not because of military actions, rather because the army divided. According to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, in this year the army went from Repton, and Halfdan went with part of the army into Northumbria and took winter quarters by the river Tyne. And the army conquered the land and often ravaged among the Picts and the Strathclyde Welsh. And the three kings, Guthrum, Acidal, and Anwend, went from Repton to Cambridge with a great army and stayed there a year. This division of the Great Heathen Army reveals both the success of the invasion. There was now enough conquered territory to support multiple Viking forces operating independently, and the natural tensions within any coalition army held together by shared purpose and the personal authority of charismatic leaders. Halfdan, possibly one of Ragnar's sons though the sources are unclear about his exact relationship to the family, took his forces north to consolidate Viking control over Northumbria and to raid beyond England's traditional borders into Scotland. The campaigns against the Picts and the Kingdom of Strathclyde served multiple purposes. They provided plunder, prevented these northern powers from threatening Viking-held Northumbria, and satisfied warriors' desire for continued military action and the glory that came with successful raids. More significantly, Halfdan began the systematic settlement of Northumbria by his warriors, distributing land to Vikings who would transition from soldiers to farmers while maintaining their military readiness. The Chronicle records, "In this year Halfdan shared out the land of Northumbria, and they proceeded to plow and to support themselves." This land distribution represents one of the most important moments in English history, the point where temporary Viking conquest became permanent Scandinavian settlement, where raiders became colonists, and where the ethnic and cultural composition of northern England was fundamentally transformed. The other portion of the army, led by Guthrum, who would become Alfred's great adversary, moved to Cambridge, positioning themselves to renew the assault on Wessex when opportunity arose. The brothers' paths diverged after 874, and reconstructing their individual fates requires piecing together fragmentary evidence from multiple sources that often contradict each other. Ivar the Boneless, the strategic genius who had guided the Great Heathen Army through its greatest victories, disappears from English sources after 870, with the last mention of him in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describing him as participating in the assault on the Kingdom of Strathclyde in Scotland. Irish annals, however, continue to mention an Amar who ruled Dublin and led Viking forces in Ireland until his death in 873, described as King of the Norsemen of all Ireland and Britain. If this Amar was indeed Ivar the Boneless, and most historians believe he was, then Ivar spent his final years consolidating Viking power in Ireland rather than participating in the later stages of the English conquest. His death in 873, just as the Great Heathen Army was completing its conquest of Mercia, removes from the historical stage the man who had perhaps contributed most to the Vikings' strategic success. Without Ivar's unifying leadership and tactical brilliance, the army fragmented into regional forces pursuing localized objectives, still formidable but lacking the coordinated strategic vision that had characterized the early campaigns. Bjorn Ironside also vanishes from the English sources, with saga tradition and continental chronicles suggesting he returned to Scandinavia or continued his Mediterranean adventures, becoming one of the most celebrated Viking leaders in Norse tradition but playing no recorded role in the later wars against Wessex. Fitzurk's fate remains obscure, with some sources suggesting he remained in England, others that he died in warfare somewhere on the continent, and still others that he returned to Scandinavia. Ubba appears in some sources as a leader who remained in England and participated in the settlement of East Anglia, possibly the same person as Ubba, who the chronicle records as being killed fighting West Saxons in Devon in 878, though the identification remains uncertain. The fragmentation of sources mirrors the fragmentation of the Great Heathen Army itself. The unified force that had terrified England in the late 860s had by the mid-870s separated into multiple Viking armies with different leaders and different objectives, still dangerous but no longer coordinating their actions with the strategic sophistication that had enabled their earlier triumphs. Alfred of Wessex, watching these developments from his royal seat at Winchester, must have recognized both the threat and the opportunity presented by the Vikings' division. The threat remained obvious. Guthrum's force at Cambridge was substantial, well-supplied, and positioned to strike into Wessex whenever its leaders decided the time was right. But the opportunity lay in the fact that Wessex now faced a single Viking army rather than the combined might of the entire Great Heathen Army, and that army's leadership was less formidable than the brothers who had conquered Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia. Alfred spent the years from 872 to 875 preparing for the inevitable renewal of Viking assault, and his preparations reveal the strategic thinking that would eventually save Wessex and, by extension, English independence. Rather than simply raising armies when needed and disbanding them after campaigning season, the traditional English approach, Alfred began creating a more permanent military infrastructure. He reformed the FYRD, the Anglo-Saxon militia system, dividing it so that half the able-bodied men served while the other half remained home to maintain agricultural production, ensuring that his kingdom could sustain extended warfare without economic collapse. He began fortifying towns, creating a network of fortified settlements that could serve as refuges for civilians, supply depots for armies, and strong points that Vikings would have to besiege rather than simply bypass. He invested in naval construction, attempting to challenge Viking naval supremacy by building larger ships that could engage Viking longships on more equal terms. Most importantly, perhaps, Alfred invested in intelligence gathering, maintaining a network of informants and scouts who could provide warning of Viking movements and intentions. These reforms took time and resources that Wessex could barely afford, and their effectiveness remained unproven, but they reflected Alfred's understanding that defeating the Vikings required matching their professionalism, their strategic patience, and their ability to sustain campaigns over multiple years. In 875, Guthrum's army moved from Cambridge to Wareham in Dorset, a coastal location that allowed resupply by sea and positioned the Vikings to strike into the heart of Wessex. Alfred, unwilling to risk battle against an army occupying a strong defensive position, negotiated instead, accepting hostages from the Vikings and extracting promises that they would leave Wessex. The Vikings broke these promises almost immediately, massacring the hostages and attempting to march west to Exeter. But a storm destroyed much of their supply fleet, forcing them to overwinter at Exeter under unfavorable conditions. In 877, they finally withdrew from Wessex, returning to Mercia where they participated in the final partition of that kingdom. Ceolwulf received the western portion, while the Vikings annexed the eastern regions, distributing land to their warriors for settlement just as Halfdan had done in Northumbria. The pattern of conquest, partition, and settlement was complete. Viking armies had conquered or cowed every English kingdom, had established permanent settlements in the richest agricultural regions of England, and had transformed themselves from invaders into colonists with every interest in defending their new territories. Yet Wessex remained unconquered, battered and diminished but still independent, still capable of fielding armies, and still led by a king who refused to accept Viking overlordship. This continuing West Saxon resistance rankled Guthrum, who had spent years campaigning against Wessex with mixed results, who had seen opportunities for decisive victory slip away, and who must have chafed at the incomplete nature of the Viking conquest while a single English kingdom remained defiant. The crisis came in January 878, In the dead of winter, when military campaigning traditionally ceased, when armies went into winter quarters and fighting paused until spring, Guthrum launched a surprise attack on Chippenham, where Alfred was celebrating Christmas with his court, gambling that a winter offensive would catch the West Saxons unprepared and that a swift strike at the heart of Wessex's government might shatter organized resistance. The gamble nearly succeeded. Alfred barely escaped Chippenham with a small bodyguard, fleeing into the marshes of Somerset while Guthrum's forces overran much of Wessex. Many West Saxon nobles submitted to Viking rule, either judging Alfred's cause hopeless or calculating that accommodation with the conquerors offered better survival prospects than feudal resistance. For several months, it appeared that Wessex would follow Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia into Viking subjugation, that the Great Heathen Army's conquest of England would be complete, and that Alfred would become a footnote in history rather than Alfred the Great. The sources from this period are limited and problematic, most written after Alfred's eventual triumph and shaped by the need to present his desperate months in hiding as a temporary setback rather than a catastrophic defeat. The famous story of Alfred burning the cakes, distracted by his plans for resistance, the disguised king neglects the cakes he was supposed to be watching for a peasant woman who doesn't recognize him, appears in sources written long after Alfred's death and probably represents legend rather than history, but it captures something true about the degradation of his circumstances, reduced from king to fugitive, dependent on the hospitality and protection of common people who risked Viking retribution by sheltering him. What Alfred did during those months remains unclear in detail but clear in outcome. He maintained contact with loyal nobles, gathered intelligence about Viking dispositions, and planned a counterattack that would require perfect timing and coordination to succeed. In May 878, Alfred emerged from hiding and sent word to the FYRD of Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire to gather at Egbert's Stone. The sources don't tell us how this message was communicated or how Alfred ensured that loyal nobles received it while Viking collaborators didn't, but the fact that an army assembled demonstrates that Alfred had maintained some form of command structure even during his months as a fugitive. The army that gathered was smaller than the forces Wessex had fielded in previous campaigns. Months of Viking occupation had taken their toll, and many West Saxons had submitted to Guthrum or simply wanted to avoid further involvement in what seemed like a lost cause, but it was sufficient for Alfred's purposes. The meeting at Egbert's Stone became mythologized in later accounts, with the Alfredian sources describing the joy of West Saxons at seeing their king alive and the enthusiasm with which they rallied to his banner. But even allowing for exaggeration, the assembly represented a remarkable achievement of leadership and organization. Alfred marched from Egbert's Stone to Aelle Oak, gathering additional forces, and then to Edington, where Guthrum's army waited. The Battle of Edington was the decisive engagement of the Viking Wars, the moment when English resistance either collapsed completely or began the long process of recovery. The sources provide frustratingly little detail about the actual fighting. The chronicle simply states that Alfred fought against the whole army and put it to flight. But the outcome was clear. The Vikings were defeated, driven back to their fortifications at Chippenham, and besieged there by Alfred's victorious forces. After 14 days, Guthrum surrendered, accepted baptism as a Christian, and agreed to withdraw his forces from Wessex. The Treaty of Wedmore, formalized after Guthrum's baptism, established the boundary between Alfred's Wessex and Viking-controlled territories, essentially recognizing the partition of England between English and Scandinavian zones of control. This partition, later formalized as the Danelaw, acknowledged what the previous 15 years of warfare had established. Vikings had conquered and settled more than half of England, but they had failed to complete the conquest, and Wessex remained the unconquered remnant of English independence. The long-term consequences of the Great Heathen Army's invasion and the wars that followed would shape English history for centuries. The Viking settlement of northern and eastern England created a cultural and linguistic boundary that persisted long after political unification, with Scandinavian influence evident in everything from place names to legal customs to everyday vocabulary. The crisis forced English kingdoms to cooperate in ways they never had before, ultimately leading to the creation of a unified English kingdom under Alfred's descendants. The military reforms Alfred implemented to survive the Viking threat, the system of buzz, the reorganized FYRD, the investment in naval power, became the foundation for English military organization for generations. The psychological impact of coming so close to complete conquest, of seeing ancient kingdoms destroyed and English culture nearly extinguished, created a sense of English identity that transcended the Old Kingdom divisions. Paradoxically, the Viking invasion that nearly destroyed Anglo-Saxon England contributed to the eventual creation of a unified English nation, as the shared experience of resistance and survival fostered a common identity among people who had previously seen themselves primarily as Northumbrians, Mercians, or West Saxons. The Great Heathen Army's campaign also demonstrated the vulnerabilities of the Anglo-Saxon political system, the dangers of kingdom fragmentation in the face of unified external threats, and the importance of military professionalism and strategic thinking, lessons that Alfred and his successors applied as they gradually reconquered Viking-held territories and built the Kingdom of England. Yet the Vikings who settled in the Danelaw weren't simply conquered and assimilated. Instead, they became part of the ethnic and cultural mix that defined medieval England, contributing to English law, language, trade networks, and military traditions. The Great Heathen Army's invasion wasn't simply an episode of violence and conquest that ended with Alfred's victories. It was a foundational event that reshaped English society, politics, and culture in ways that persisted for centuries and still echo in modern England. The Great Heathen Army's invasion also marked a turning point in Viking history more broadly, representing perhaps the high-water mark of Viking military success in Western Europe. Never again would Vikings achieve conquests on this scale. Never again would they come so close to establishing permanent kingdoms that could rival the power of established Christian realms. Subsequent Viking expeditions, including renewed invasions of England in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, would achieve temporary successes but would ultimately fail to establish lasting political control, and the gradual Christianization of Scandinavia itself would transform Viking society in ways that made large-scale raiding expeditions less feasible and less culturally central. The sons of Ragnar, whether historical figures or legendary composites, represented a particular moment in Viking history when military prowess, strategic vision, and historical circumstance aligned to produce conquests that would never be repeated. The warriors who followed them, who settled in England, who became farmers while maintaining their martial traditions, represented the end of one era of Viking history and the beginning of another. No longer purely raiders from across the sea but residents of the lands they had conquered, with interests and identities that would gradually diverge from their Scandinavian cousins who remained in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The cultural legacy of the Great Heathen Army extended far beyond military and political history into the realm of language, law, and social organization. In the regions that became the Danelaw, Scandinavian legal concepts were introduced that differed significantly from Anglo-Saxon traditions, with different approaches to property rights, different procedures for resolving disputes, and different social hierarchies. The English language absorbed hundreds of Scandinavian words, particularly terms related to law, governance, and everyday life. Words like law itself, husband, knife, sky, egg, and countless others entered English through contact with Norse settlers. Place names throughout northern and eastern England preserve evidence of Scandinavian settlement, with the suffixes by farm or village, thorp, secondary settlement, and thwaite, clearing, marking locations where Vikings established communities. The density of these Scandinavian place names in regions like Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and East Anglia provides modern scholars with a rough map of Viking settlement patterns and suggests that Scandinavian colonization was extensive and thorough, not merely a thin layer of foreign conquerors ruling over English populations, but substantial immigration that changed the ethnic and cultural composition of entire regions. Archaeological evidence supports this picture of extensive settlement, with distinctive Scandinavian artifacts, burial practices, and building styles appearing throughout the Danelaw in the late 9th and 10th centuries. indicating communities that maintained Norse cultural practices even as they adapted to life in England and began interacting with English neighbors. The memory of the Great Heathen Army and the Sons of Ragnar was preserved and transformed by successive generations of storytellers, chroniclers, and saga writers, each reshaping the narrative to serve their own purposes and reflect their own concerns. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written from a West Saxon perspective and concerned primarily with promoting Alfred's dynasty, presents the Vikings as a heathen scourge that Alfred heroically resisted, emphasizing English survival and eventual triumph while downplaying the extent and permanence of Viking conquest. Norse sagas, written down centuries after the events they describe, transformed Ragnar and his sons into legendary figures whose exploits became increasingly fantastical with each retelling, incorporating mythological elements, improbable adventures, and moral lessons that reflected the concerns of 13th century Iceland rather than 9th century England. Medieval English hagiographers, creating saints' lives like that of Saint Edmund, emphasized Christian martyrdom and divine providence, casting the Viking invasion as a test of faith and an opportunity for martyrs to demonstrate their devotion. Each of these narrative traditions contains some historical truth mixed with elaboration, propaganda, and invention, and modern historians must carefully sift through these sources, comparing different accounts, evaluating the biases of each chronicler, and supplementing textual evidence with archaeological and linguistic data to reconstruct what actually happened during those crucial years between 865 and 878. The result is a picture that's less dramatic than the sagas suggest but more complex than the chronicle admits. A story of military conquest that succeeded beyond its originator's expectations, of cultural transformation that created hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian communities, of political fragmentation that nearly destroyed English independence but ultimately contributed to English unification, and of historical contingency where small decisions and accidents of fate shaped outcomes that affected centuries of subsequent history. The question of whether the Great Heathen Army's invasion was primarily motivated by revenge for Ragnar's death, or whether revenge was merely a convenient rallying cry for warriors who would have invaded anyway remains debated by historians. The sources, particularly the Norse sagas, emphasize revenge as the primary motive, presenting the invasion as a filial duty and a matter of honor that superseded all other considerations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, by contrast, makes no mention of Ragnar or revenge, presenting the invasion as simply another, albeit larger, Viking raid motivated by the prospect of plunder and conquest. Modern historians note that Viking raids on England had been intensifying throughout the early 9th century, that economic and demographic pressures in Scandinavia were creating surplus populations that needed new lands for settlement, and that the evident wealth and military weakness of English kingdoms made them attractive targets regardless of any personal grievances. The Great Heathen Army's behavior after landing, negotiating for horses, establishing winter quarters, conducting systematic campaigns rather than hit-and-run raids, suggests planning and organization that went beyond simple revenge and reflected broader strategic objectives. Yet the timing of the invasion, coming shortly after Ragnar's reported death, and the fact that Ragnar's sons are identified in multiple sources as leaders of the expedition, suggests that revenge might have been the catalyst that transformed general interest in conquering England into a specific large-scale military campaign. Perhaps the most historically sound interpretation is that Ragnar's execution provided the emotional motivation and the unifying cause that allowed his sons to assemble an unprecedented coalition of Viking forces, but that the campaign's objectives evolved from simple revenge to territorial conquest as opportunities for permanent settlement became apparent. The Vikings who joined the Great Heathen Army likely had mixed motivations, some driven by loyalty to Ragnar's sons and the desire to avenge a legendary leader, others attracted by the prospect of land and wealth, still others seeking glory and the kind of heroic reputation that could only be won through great deeds in great campaigns. The genius of the sons of Ragnar, particularly Ivar, was in channeling these diverse motivations into a unified military effort that achieved objectives far beyond what any individual Viking leader could have accomplished alone. The impact of the Great Heathen Army's invasion on the development of English national identity deserves particular attention, as the crisis of Viking conquest contributed significantly to the emergence of concepts of Englishness that transcended the Old Kingdom divisions. Before the Viking invasions, people identified primarily with their kingdoms, as Northumbrians, Mercians, East Anglians, or West Saxons, with only weak sense of common English identity beyond shared language and Christian religion. The destruction of independent English kingdoms and the establishment of Viking control over most of England created a situation where Wessex became, by default, the sole repository of English political independence and cultural continuity. Alfred and his successors consciously promoted the idea that they ruled not just Wessex but all the English people, including those living under Viking rule in the Danelaw, and that their wars against the Vikings were wars of English liberation rather than merely West Saxon territorial aggrandizement. This propaganda, spread through chronicles, legal codes, coinage, and other media, helped create a sense of English national identity that would persist after the political reunification of England. The shared experience of suffering under Viking conquest, of seeing English kingdoms destroyed and English culture threatened with extinction, created a form of collective trauma and collective memory that bound together people who had previously seen themselves as separate. The contrast between Christian English and pagan Vikings, though this religious distinction became blurred as Vikings converted to Christianity and integrated into English society, provided another basis for defining Englishness in opposition to foreign invaders. By the time Alfred's grandson Athelstan completed the reconquest of the Danelaw in the early 10th century, the concept of England as a unified kingdom encompassing all English-speaking Christians in Britain, regardless of their regional origins, had become politically and culturally established, and this unified English identity owed much to the crisis provoked by the Great Heathen Army's invasion. Ironically, the Viking conquest that nearly destroyed English civilization contributed to the creation of a stronger, more unified English nation than had existed before the invasions, though that nation would continue to include substantial Scandinavian cultural influences that persisted from the settlement period. The military innovations and tactical lessons of the Great Heathen Army's campaign influenced European warfare for generations. The Vikings demonstrated the effectiveness of fortified camps as bases for sustained campaigns, prefiguring the medieval castle-based strategies that would dominate European warfare in subsequent centuries. Their use of cavalry, acquired by seizing horses from the English, showed how Vikings could adapt their tactics to new environments and overcome their traditional limitation of being purely infantry and naval forces. The systematic approach to conquest, with coordinated campaigns against multiple targets, winter quarters for rest and planning, and strategic patience that allowed them to avoid battle when circumstances were unfavorable, represented a level of military professionalism that few European forces of the period could match. English responses to the Viking threat, particularly Alfred's reforms, also demonstrated innovations that would influence medieval military organization. The system of Buzz created a network of fortified positions that controlled territory and protected populations. The reformed FYRD provided a more sustainable military service system than the old arrangements, and the investment in naval power acknowledged that controlling the seas was essential for defending an island nation. These mutual adaptations, Vikings learning from English resistance, English learning from Viking successes, created a kind of military arms race that accelerated the development of more sophisticated warfare in Britain. The military culture of the Danelaw, blending Norse martial traditions with English methods and creating a society where all free men were expected to be warriors while also being farmers or craftsmen, produced a distinctively effective military system that made the Danelaw regions formidable even after they were politically reintegrated into the English kingdom. The elite warrior culture of the Scandinavian North, with its emphasis on personal courage, loyalty to leaders, and the pursuit of glory, merged with English concepts of military service and created hybrid military traditions that influenced English warfare well into the medieval period. The economic consequences of the Great Heathen Army's invasion were profound and long-lasting, though difficult to quantify precisely given the limitations of 9th century economic data. The immediate impact was undoubtedly devastating. The Chronicle and other sources describe widespread destruction of monasteries, burning of towns, disruption of agricultural production, and the extraction of enormous quantities of silver in tribute payments. The monastery at Lindisfarne, already sacked in 793 in the raid that announced the Viking Age to Western Europe, was finally abandoned during this period, and numerous other religious houses suffered similar fates, representing not just spiritual and cultural losses but economic ones, as monasteries were major landowners, agricultural producers, and nodes in trade networks. Yet the longer-term economic impact was more complex than simple destruction. Viking settlement brought new trading connections linking England to Scandinavian and Baltic trade networks, with cities like York becoming major commercial centers where Norse merchants traded goods from as far away as the Middle East and Central Asia. The Vikings' familiarity with silver-based monetary economy and their minting of coins facilitated commercial development in regions they controlled. Archaeological evidence suggests that towns in the Danelaw experienced growth and prosperity in the late 9th and 10th centuries, with increased craft production, expanded trade, and urban development that created economic dynamism despite, or perhaps because of, the disruptions of conquest and settlement. The redistribution of land to Viking warriors, breaking up existing patterns of landholding and creating new agricultural communities, might have increased productivity in some regions even as it dispossessed English landowners. The demand for military equipment, ships, and supplies created economic opportunities for craftsmen and merchants who could serve both English and Viking customers. When political stability eventually returned under Alfred's successors, the combined economy of Anglo-Scandinavian England proved remarkably productive and resilient, funding the construction of baths, the maintenance of armies and navies, and the cultural flowering of the late Anglo-Saxon period. The Great Heathen Army's invasion, for all its immediate destructiveness, contributed to economic transformations that helped lay the groundwork for England's medieval prosperity. The religious and cultural dimensions of the Viking conquest deserve careful consideration, as the invasion represented not just a political and military crisis but a clash of cultures and faiths that would have profound long-term consequences. The Vikings arrived as pagans, worshipping Odin, Thor, and the other gods of the Norse pantheon, practicing religious customs that Christians found abhorrent, and showing particular hostility to Christian churches and monasteries that combined symbolic significance with portable wealth. The systematic destruction of English monasteries, the killing of monks and nuns, the burning of manuscripts and religious artifacts, represented an assault on English Christian culture that contemporaries experienced as not merely military defeat but spiritual catastrophe. The martyrdom narratives that emerged from this period, like the story of Saint Edmund, reflect the religious dimension of the conflict and the Christian interpretation of Viking conquest as divine punishment for English sins, a test of faith, or a prelude to eventual Christian triumph. Yet the religious landscape proved more complex than a simple conflict between Christian and pagan. Vikings showed pragmatic flexibility about religion, often accepting Christian baptism when it served their interests, Guthrum's conversion after his defeat at Edington being only the most famous example, and integrating Christian practices into their own religious worldview without necessarily abandoning their traditional beliefs entirely. The Norse gods and heroes continued to be honored by Scandinavian settlers even after formal Christian conversion, with archaeological evidence showing Thor's hammers and other pagan symbols appearing alongside Christian crosses in graves throughout the Danelaw. English Christians and Scandinavian pagans proved capable of coexistence and cooperation when political circumstances made it advantageous, trading with each other, entering into military alliances, and sometimes intermarrying despite religious differences. Within 2 or 3 generations, most Scandinavian settlers had converted to Christianity, partly through missionary efforts, partly through intermarriage and social pressure, and partly through the practical advantages of belonging to the dominant religious culture of their new homeland. The conversion of Scandinavia itself, which accelerated in the 10th and 11th centuries, owed something to the influence of Christianized Vikings returning from England and bringing new religious ideas back to their homelands. The cultural exchange moved in both directions, with Norse storytelling traditions, artistic styles, and social customs influencing English culture even as Christianity and English language influenced the settlers. The result, by the 11th century, was an Anglo-Scandinavian culture in the Danelaw that was Christian in religion, but retained distinctively Norse characteristics in law, language, social organization, and cultural practices. The role of women in the Great Heathen Army's campaign and subsequent Viking settlement presents challenges for historical reconstruction because the sources, written by men for male audiences and focused primarily on warfare and politics, provide limited information about women's experiences and contributions. Yet careful reading of available evidence and comparison with better documented periods and regions suggests that women played important roles in both the military campaign and the settlement process. Viking armies typically included women who served as healers, managed logistics, maintained camps, and sometimes participated in combat. The legendary shield maidens of Norse saga might be exaggerated, but archaeological evidence of female burials with weapons in Scandinavia and the Danelaw indicates that some women did take up arms and fight. More importantly, for the long-term success of Viking settlement, women came from Scandinavia to join their husbands, brothers, and fathers in England, establishing households, bearing children, and creating the family structures that transformed military camps into permanent communities. The genetic evidence from modern populations in regions of the Danelaw shows both Scandinavian male and female ancestry, confirming that Viking settlement involved substantial immigration of women, not just warriors taking English wives. These Scandinavian women brought with them Norse customs, language, and cultural practices that they passed on to their children, contributing to the creation of Anglo-Scandinavian culture. Women also appear in the sources as marriage alliances between English and Scandinavian elites, with marriages helping to cement political agreements and facilitate integration of conquerors and conquered. The peace between Alfred and Guthrum, for example, was reinforced by the marriage of Alfred's daughter Ethelflaed to a Mercian nobleman who would help defend against further Viking incursions, and similar marriage alliances occurred at lower social levels throughout the Danelaw. Women's economic roles as managers of households, participants in craft production, and occasionally as independent traders meant that they contributed significantly to the economic integration of Viking and English communities. The exclusion of women from most historical sources doesn't mean they were absent from or unimportant to the historical processes of conquest and settlement, merely that recovering their stories requires reading sources against the grain and drawing on archaeological and anthropological evidence to supplement the written record. The question of how English populations experienced and responded to Viking conquest and settlement remains one of the most difficult to answer definitively, because the sources were written by and for elites and tell us relatively little about the experiences of common people who made up the vast majority of the population. Some English people clearly resisted Viking rule. The continued warfare, the rebellions mentioned sporadically in chronicles, and the eventual reconquest of the Danelaw by English kings all suggest that Viking rule never achieved universal acceptance. Yet others must have accommodated themselves to new rulers, whether out of pragmatic calculation, genuine indifference to which lords extracted their taxes, or even preference for Viking overlords who might have been less oppressive than previous English rulers. The distinction between English and Viking became blurred within a generation or two as intermarriage, cultural exchange, and shared residence in the same territories created hybrid identities. An English farmer in Northumbria might hate the Vikings who had killed his previous lord, displaced his community, and destroyed his church, or he might appreciate that his new Scandinavian lord demanded lower rents and allowed him more legal rights than his old English lord had. The sources give us glimpses of this complex reality. English nobles who served Viking rulers, Scandinavian warriors who married English women and adopted English names for their children, communities where Norse and English languages blended into new dialects, towns where churches and pagan temples existed in close proximity. The process of conquest and settlement created winners and losers within both English and Scandinavian communities, with some individuals benefiting from new opportunities while others suffered dispossession and violence. Reducing this complexity to a simple narrative of English versus Vikings obscures the messier reality of how real people navigated changing political circumstances, made pragmatic choices to ensure their survival and prosperity, and gradually created new social arrangements that incorporated elements from both cultures. By the early 10th century, the question of whether someone was English or Viking mattered less in practical terms than questions of land ownership, legal status, political loyalty to specific rulers, and participation in local communities that included people of diverse ethnic backgrounds. The legacy of the Great Heathen Army extends beyond the immediate medieval period into the shaping of English institutions, culture, and identity that would influence centuries of subsequent history. The creation of a unified English kingdom, driven by the need to resist and eventually reconquer Viking territories, established political structures and administrative systems that persisted through the Norman conquest and into the early modern period. The legal traditions of the Danelaw, blending Scandinavian and English customs, contributed to the development of English common law and concepts of legal rights that would eventually influence legal systems throughout the English-speaking world. The cultural memory of Alfred's resistance against the Vikings became a foundational narrative of English history, invoked repeatedly during later crises as a symbol of national survival against foreign invasion. Elizabeth I England facing the Spanish Armada, Churchill's Britain resisting Nazi Germany, both explicitly referenced Alfred's example as precedent and inspiration for resistance against seemingly overwhelming odds. The linguistic legacy of Scandinavian settlement, with hundreds of Norse words permanently embedded in English, helped create a language of unusual flexibility and cosmopolitanism that would become a global lingua franca. The maritime traditions and trading connections established during the Viking Age contributed to England's eventual emergence as a naval power and commercial empire. Even the physical landscape of England bears the marks of Viking settlement, with place names, settlement patterns, and archaeological remains providing tangible connections to 9th century events. The Great Heathen Army's invasion represented a crisis that could have destroyed English civilization, but paradoxically it contributed to the creation of something new and enduring. A unified English nation with hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture, political institutions tested and strengthened by existential threat, and a historical narrative of survival and triumph that would shape English identity for centuries to come. As we reflect on the story of the Great Heathen Army, from its formation as a revenge expedition for Ragnar Lothbrok's death to its transformation into a conquering force that reshaped England, we must acknowledge both the brutality and the historical significance of these events. The invasion brought immense suffering, thousands killed in warfare, communities destroyed, cultural treasures lost forever, lives disrupted by violence and forced displacement. The chronicles and saints' lives that emerged from this period document genuine trauma and horror that shouldn't be romanticized or minimized. Yet the same events that brought such suffering also contributed to historical transformations that shaped the modern world. The creation of England as a unified nation, the development of more sophisticated political and military institutions, the cultural blending that enriched English language and society, and the precedents for resistance and survival that would inspire later generations. History is often made by violence and conquest, by ambitious warriors pursuing glory and revenge, by the collision of cultures and the forced integration of different peoples, and the story of the Great Heathen Army exemplifies this uncomfortable reality. Whether we should celebrate or mourn these events depends on our perspective and values, but what we cannot do is ignore their profound importance for understanding how medieval England emerged from the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and Viking invasions to become the unified realm that would eventually project its language, laws, and institutions across the globe. The sons of Ragnar, seeking revenge for their father's death, unleashed forces that shaped centuries of history in ways they could never have imagined, and King Aelle, executing a captured Viking leader, made a decision whose consequences cascaded far beyond his immediate political objectives. The Great Heathen Army's campaign reminds us that history turns on individual decisions that seem reasonable or even necessary in the moment, but whose long-term consequences reshape the world in unexpected and irreversible ways, and that the past's violence and triumph, tragedy and transformation, remain intimately connected to the present we inhabit and the futures we will create.